Hey guys, so we're still waiting on that ban list, but until then, I guess we just have to keep chugging along. And so as usual, I wanted to provide a tier list of the best hand traps and staples for this current format using Dueling Book data through YCS, as well as also looking at topping deck lists from YCS Sydney and the cards that were played. And before we continue, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as sleeves and other supplies. All of that can be found in the video description below. Okay, let's just get started with the tier list for this month, and we're going to start with Ash. Nothing too spectacular about that. I think what's interesting though during this kind of, quote-unquote tier 0 format is that I know at the beginning of when this format was about to start, some people, a lot of people maybe, expected Ash to maybe not see as much play because it allows the opponent to kind of play through and, Hita and combo off and whatever, but really that hasn't been the case for the most part since the new format started. Every single tournament, most lists were playing a Ash. And then we have Imperm, which is, of course, was already popular going into the new format because of how good it was against YCS, which, of course, that deck in itself has really fallen off the radar completely. But you know what? It is still good to have. Doesn't play into Talents, which is nice because it is a pretty hand trap heavy format. And we're going to see later Talents being pretty popular. At the same time, Imperm just on like Snake Eye Ash, and you just hope that that's does the trick, but probably not. But at the very least, it's there. Nibiru is another good one in terms of especially like Snake Eye decks. I think, especially in comparison to something like Droll, it's of course another pretty popular card, but I think if you had to choose between the two, people will probably lean towards Nibiru more, even though of course they can kind of play through it pretty decently well. But you know what, it's good to have, of course, again, something like Voiceless Voice, which, outside of the Fire King Snake Eye decks, that's kind of like the next most represented deck, and it's not really going to come up against them unless they do like the Dynamondo line turn 1, I guess, but that's kind of playing into greedy into not only Nibiru but also Ghost Spell as well. And then speaking of Droll and Lockbird, this is still there. Now, one thing though is I don't think it's main decked as much, maybe at the earlier part of the format, because I was looking at YCS Sydney. I kind of mapped out all the most played hand traps for the purpose of this video, and really it was kind of a even split in terms of main deck Droll or side deck. It was kind of like 55% towards main, but you know what, still something you do have to respect, but perhaps not as common in the main deck anymore. And then we lastly have Cosmic Cyclone in this category. So these are kind of like the cards in tier 8, basically represent cards that you would probably expect most lists to have within their main or side, basically. Cosmic Cyclone is good not only because of, let's say you get rid of, I don't know, whatever's in the spell trap zone like IP, but also something like Summon Limit and Anti-Spell Fragments have been relatively pretty popular lately. And not to mention, there's actually a rise in like stun decks as well. I don't think I've seen a format where we've seen this many like stun decks in like regional top 8s as we've seen so far in this current format, at least not for a while anyways, where Mystic Bind was legal. Next, moving on, we have Valor, kind of similar lines of Imperm, I guess. Just like Effect Negation has been pretty popular ever since Rescue Ace was tier 1, basically. And of course, you're going to see Ghostmourner a little bit later as well. Talents, we talked about this earlier, really strong. This is one of the cards I actually kind of mentioned in my balance prediction. I really do hope they would finally hit this card at least to like 1. Just because, nowadays, like when you have to hand trap your opponent, because otherwise Snake Eye, that's going to be kind of hard to go through that board because of its also grind game as well. But, just being punished for trying to hand trap your opponent, for trying to have a chance at winning going second, I think Talents is just really strong. But, who knows if they would actually hit it. And then we have Summon Limit. This is another one that was on my ban list prediction. Hopefully they do actually take care of it entirely in terms of banning. I know a lot of people are predicting like a limit, for example, because they did it with the other Floodgates and Rivalry. There can be only one, what have you. But the one difference with Summon Limit is that, and also Anti-Spell Fragments is, unlike those Floodgates, like any deck can play these, because no matter how often you summon or how many spells you play in terms of Anti-Spell Fragments, like as long as you go first and you do your whole board, it doesn't matter, right? At that point, you just set this and then whatever. Like your opponent's just not going to be able to play. And I have a pretty special connection with Summon Limit in particular. Way back about 5 years ago when I was first started playing Cyber Dragons, this was like the Floodgate that was like in my side deck all the time, and when people would force me to go first. So I do love this card, but I do think hopefully it does actually go away. Next, we have Ghost Spell. This is not bad. I would say, about like a little over half of the YCS topping lists were playing this, at least among the lists that were publicly available. I think it's a little bit of hit and miss with Ghost Spell because, in terms of the matchups, like let's say Snake Eye, like you can get potentially chain blocked, and also let's say in terms of something like Branded, it can just straight up be dead a lot of times when they have Branded lost up. So those are things I think if you are a deck with a lot of flexible spots, which a lot of decks are at this point in the modern era, then yeah, sure, why not? Especially, I mean, Labyrinth hasn't been really doing too well lately, but that is also something Ghost Spell can be really good against. So I would say it's pretty decent. And then you have Ghostmourner. This one's an interesting one because among the hand traps, or rather among cards that are played both main and side, this was like by far the common theme, where they were playing at least like one in the main and then the rest in the side. Kind of an interesting trend. I mean, on one hand, it can also serve as a bit of a time card too, because your opponent would take burn damage if they kind of like get rid of that monster. So I guess that's also an additional application on top of the actual rather negation effect. And it's also like a level 3 tuner. I guess it does sometimes come up, at least in decks like Kashira, which is also technically kind of popular when you look outside of Snake Eye and Fire King. That helps you go into like Barone plays. And then we have Crossout. This is of course primarily because of like all the whole Fire King Snake Eye mirror matches, because it's good for any card in the mirror. But of course we are expecting a lot of hand traps being played right now, so really it's probably going to be live for the most part, at the very least. Definitely at a YCS level. Of course, once you get to kind of like local level, this card is probably maybe not the best thing to put in your list, because you may not have that many Fire King Snake Eye lists, at least at your locals. And then we have Bestials in general. This originally at the start of the format really tanked in play, but I think lately it's actually seen a lot of respect, because it can actually be quite good. I mean, being able to get rid of that IP in the grave is actually pretty good. Not to mention, especially in a deck like, let's say, Voiceless Voice, they can actually off Magnet search something like Saphira. It is a dragon, and also for Branded, they can also search something like, of course, Shrouded Dragon. But Fallen of Albats is actually a pretty good search in this current format, because into like a Fire King board, Albat summon is actually pretty good. So Bestials, I would say, even though we don't actually have really many Dragon Link decks topping at all, especially even at the regional level, I do think there's actually a good amount of decks citing Bestials along with Druid's Worm. And then we have Call by the Grave. Nothing really to say about this. A, we have a lot of hand traps being played right now, but B, just going even second, again, just Fire King, Snake Eye, they have a lot of things coming, trying to come back from the grave as well, especially also effects that happen on like either turn, so being able to shut off the effects as well is also a nice bonus. So now moving on to C tier, I don't think I'd ever see Feather Duster this low, but it's actually not being played that much, at least relatively speaking, because usually it's seen in really pretty much every list. So you know what, that is something. I mean, it's searchable off of Thrust, which is something we're going to get to, because that's also seen a lot of decline in play lately. So this is kind of interesting, but similar lines. You also have Lightning Storm. I mean, if you have the space to play it, you can. I mean, back row decks are really annoying, and as I mentioned earlier, stun decks are actually kind of on the rise right now, because it's just like a cheap way to try to beat Fire King Snake Eyes. It's never fun to play against those decks, but you know what, if you don't have back row removal, especially even at like a regional level, it might cost you. And then we have Fenrir. This is something I've been kind of mentioning the last month or so. Maybe I need to just not include Fenrir anymore, just because there's actually a lot of Kesh tier decks, or, I should say quote unquote lot, relative, of course, outside of Fire King Snake Eye. So, it kind of gets beefed up unintentionally there, because Kesh tier is just playing it as well, not only as a board breaker, but just as like an engine piece, as well as I guess Vanquish Soul too. But nonetheless, it's still decent, I would say, because you're not seeing a lot of non-Fire King Snake Eye decks. You're not really seeing Fenrir as kind of like that generic card that, a lot of decks were playing just like not that long ago, but nonetheless, still a pretty good card. And then we talked about this Thrust. So interestingly, I was looking at the topping list from YCS Cine. None of the Fire King or Snake Eye decks were playing Thrust, actually. They were all played in the non-other decks like Thunder, Keshira, Vanquish Soul, Branded Despia is, of course, kind of a given when it comes to this card. So, in that case, you're going to see also a lot of different kind of cards, let's say like Dark Ruler. We're going to talk about that later. That would also see a dip in play, because not only is it not that amazing right now, but, it was something that's searchable off of Thrust, but not a lot of people are playing Thrust. So a lot of these like kind of one-off cards are not seeing that much play now. And then speaking of kind of Dark Ruler, but we have Droplet, which I guess is perhaps, better for this format, just because you do have a lot of things happening like on your own turn that your opponent's kind of triggering during like, in terms of like Snake Eye stuff, as well as, always going to come up against something like, let's say, Voiceless Voice, where really you just have to kind of negate like the Skull Guardian for the most part. And, depending on the deck that you play, you can benefit off of like the discards and sending as cost from the field. But, it's not too play, but it is definitely seeing more play than we have been, especially since that Arise Heart ban. And then speaking of Arise Heart, I guess kind of similar is Dimension Shifter. Of course, you're going to see it in Thunder, you're going to see it in Keshira, as well as Vanquish Soul, and some other, janky rogue decks, I'm sure, that are trying to have a chance right now in this current format against Fire King, which Dimension Shifter is, of course, very strong, and that's the reason why it never really scales that high in terms of tier ranking, because most decks cannot actually play Shifter. And then we have Super Poly. So I don't think this card is actually that great in this format. And, you know, of course, Branded Despia is a deck that I've been playing for the past year. That they've always played this in the main deck. But now a lot of lists aren't even playing Super Poly either, which is saying something. I would say if you have the room to play the more niche Super Poly targets, like let's say like the Earth Golem, or maybe like, I don't know, something like Draco Kozid on top of something like, you know, Garura Mud Dragon, then sure. Like Voiceless Voice, for example, they have a very flexible extra deck. If, you know, someone's playing Super Poly, like that's another good candidate. But nonetheless, I would say against like a Fire King, you know, Snake Eye board, Super Poly, I don't think it's that good. You know, Flamberge will just bring back some stuff anyways. Against Voiceless Voice, definitely not great because, you know, their Ritual Spell will just spit out another Skull Guardian anyways, and they bring back low. It's just, you're kind of just nagging yourself, I find. I mean, obviously, in some situations, it can be good, but I would say as kind of like a generic side deck card, it's definitely kind of falling in favor. So next, we have Evenly Matched, which honestly, I'm a little bit surprised that it's still pretty low. I do think it is technically good into like a Fire King board. It's just that obviously it means you're sacrificing battle phase, which means they are going to live and they have an insane clapback game. That's where it becomes problematic. I mean, I guess maybe it's because for me, I play Branded. I'm about to, you know, Gimmick Locked, I'm going second. So me clearing their board is actually quite strong because I know they're not going to be able to come back once I lock them. So I guess it kind of depends on the deck, but I do think it's still a pretty strong card. And then we have DD Crow. There's another card. I guess I'm a little bit surprised. Maybe it's that low, but I guess you just don't really have the space to fit everything in your main or slide deck in this current age where, you know, you have to play so many different hand traps. I do think in a particular situation, let's say against Brandon, you know, DD Crow, I would say is better than something like Ghost Spell, for example. And, you know, DD Crow really does come up against a lot of top decks right now, right? Any kind of Snake Eye deck, you know, it's definitely pretty applicable against something like Voiceless Voice, obviously very good against, you know, something like Low or even like their Ritual spell to prevent them from being able to kind of spit out another like Skull Guardian if you are trying to get rid of them on the field currently. So I do think DD Crow is pretty good if you are able to fit it. And moving on to the final tier, we do have Solemn Strike. I don't think I've seen this card on this tier list in quite some time. Maybe during like Eldritch times when that was tier 1. So it's been a while. Obviously, it can be pretty good. You know, being able to not only negate effects but clearing bodies, pretty good. And I do think that you do see this time and time from like the Fire King Snake Eye side decks. And then we have Anti-Spell Fragrance. This is something that I was surprised it wasn't played as much at YCS Sydney because I just feel like any kind of regional level event, I'm just constantly seeing this card along with something like Summon Limit, as I mentioned earlier. You know, as long as you get to go first, no matter how many spells you play in your deck, like you can always play this card, right? Like it doesn't, you're probably gonna win at that point. You know, it's just a kind of like a forcing them into submission. So really strong. These are the kind of floodgates I hope that they Konami addresses soon enough because I'm tired of seeing this card all the time. But you know, interestingly enough, the win percentage on Dueling Book when this card was played was very low, 31%. This was also the case for Summon Limit, which I should have mentioned. If I had to guess, it's probably because it's more so from like the stun decks that are playing this, where, you know, they're not maybe winning as much and maybe they're rage quitting, I'm not sure. But because obviously if you're like a Fire King Snake Eye deck that's playing this, you're probably really winning that game because on top of whatever you already have. So that's sort of my guess at the low win percentage, which is why I always kind of caution in terms of, you know, interpreting the win percentage numbers off of YGO, and that's why I don't weigh it as much in terms of the formula. And finally, we have Dark Ruler No More. We did talk about this a little bit earlier. It is something you can search off Thrust, but you know, when you're not seeing that much play in Thrust, you're probably indirectly going to see a little bit of decline in play at Dark Ruler No More as well. I mean, I think it's kind of decent. I personally play it at just one, just to search off of Thrust. You never know what kind of different decks you go against. That's not, you know, Snake Eye Fire King. Even against Snake Eye Fire King, you know what? If you're a deck that completely hard loses to Appaloosa, it's something that you might still have to consider anyways. So yeah, I mean, usually, you know, whenever you see like Dark Ruler and Forbidden Droplet kind of like switching places in terms of play depending on the kind of end board that happens in whatever format. So I'm sure we'll see this rise and play again at some point, but maybe just not now. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight a couple more cards. So Soul Release, Kirkard Div Incarnate. These are cards, of course, that you're going to see some amount of play because of the Fire King Snake Eye format right now. They were not available on YGOscope.com. I don't know if it's because the site cannot identify it or it's just because there weren't enough play of these cards on Dueling Book among all players. But nonetheless, I just wanted to highlight them to show that I didn't forget. I believe they were seen in about 4 to 5 lists among the topping lists at YCS Sydney that were available. So you know what? They are some options, at least for Soul Release. For the other decks, Kirkara, obviously it's really just being seen in the Fire King decks because they do have a couple of ways to search it. Alright guys, so that was it for the tier list of the best hand traps and staples for the current month. Hopefully we just get that balance pretty soon so we can shake things up a little bit. I think we're a little bit tired of